It is a very uncanny feeling when something you always knew would inevitably happen at some point finally starts happening. That is the feeling I got when watching the riots happening in England and Northern Ireland over the past weeks. Now, there were many different spins on the recent riots depending on which kind of media sources one consumes. The most prevalent narrative in the mainstream media is that those are far-right racist riots perpetrated by fascist thugs. More than that, these riots were started due to the spread of disinformation about the origins of the perpetrator of the horrendous murder of the 3 young girls, possibly even spread by Russia to sow discord in Western societies. Different angle is that these riots are a culmination of years of anger and frustration of certain strata of the population with the failed integration of massive numbers of migrants into Britain, as well as the unequal approach of the law enforcement forces to different communities in the UK, sparked by horrendous murder of several British children. Some might say that it is a reaction to the worsening situation of the British working class, exacerbated by the influx of newcomers, putting public services under even larger pressure. There is most likely some truth to most of these interpretations. However sympathetic one might be to the plight of people deeply angered and frustrated by the negative impacts of unwanted mass immigration, one cannot deny that there was a lot of completely unconstructive violence, chaos, and thuggery. These kinds of riots will always appeal to a certain strata of people who just want to make a big mess. They also almost certainly won't lead to any meaningful political changes, since their violent nature undermined the legitimacy of the grievances about immigration, in the eyes of both the elites and large part of the public. It is also clear that certain people attending these riots were authentically far-right in the conventional meaning of the word, not the modern mainstream definition broadened and bloated to absurd proportions, since there was, for example, footage of people with Nazi insignia tattooed on their bodies. It is also true that there was disinformation about the identity of the perpetrator of the crime at the beginning of these riots. At first, information that he was a recent asylum claimant of Muslim faith that was allegedly already on the radar of security services spread among the public. This claim provided the riots with the anti-Muslim twist that was revealed, for example, in the attacks on the mosque, and it turned out to be wrong information. But it is also obviously absolutely reductive and false to just reduce the current mayhem to some kind of disinformation-induced episode. Even if there might be some disinformation floating in the online space, it does not have any palpable effect if it does not fall on fertile ground. It is not like your average London-based suburban college-educated liberal-leaning voter is going to see some message on his Telegram and say to himself, "Oh boy, I'm for sure going to find me some Union Jack flag, make a couple of petrol bombs, and head to the city right after my shift as a graphic designer ends today in the afternoon." One Czech journalist called the obsession with Russian disinformation allegedly influencing everything just a conspiracy theory for college-educated people, and I think this is pretty accurate. It is basically an inverse version of the NPC meme, which the right likes to use, where a lot of people seem to imagine members of the working class as some kind of completely unanimated vegetables without their own agenda, just waiting till the new inflammatory piece of disinformation produced by some Russia-based troll farm is published. That is retarded. But I'm just spitballing here. The point is that if nothing resembling the horrendous murder that took place in Southport hadn't happened before, and if people had good reason to believe that it would not happen again, there wouldn't be any riots. Stuff like that does not happen in a vacuum. And if we zoom out a bit more, we can start to perceive the riots as yet something else. The beginning of a new period of ethnic conflict in Western European politics. Most Western European countries are now firmly multi-ethnic societies. Even though many disagree with me on this, I am firmly persuaded that this will not fundamentally change in the foreseeable future. It might be slowed down, the nature of the ethnic mix might change, the integration process might get more successful, and the balance of legal and illegal immigration might flux. Still, overall, the social dynamics causing the processes are just too powerful. The Western European countries are still collectively one of the most developed regions on the planet, with one of the highest living standards. While the problems of Western Europe are many and quite dire, it is entirely possible and even likely that the internal social issues of most non-Western societies are even worse. They are just much less covered and understood by Western audiences. More than that, modern Western Europe is still anthropologically and culturally more prone to accepting foreign immigration than other large developed regions on the planet, like East Asia, even though less than the Anglosphere settler countries. Although significant anti-immigration sentiments in Western Europe aren't going anywhere anytime soon, they are far from universal among the native populations, and are most prevalent among those parts of Western European societies that are not sufficiently represented among the political, economic and cultural elites. The economic system, based on mass production and consumption, largely depends on an influx of people to maintain the facade of some economic dynamism, while the native populations are declining all over Western Europe, although at various speeds depending on the country. So, the pull factors of immigration are not really going anywhere. The push factors, in the form of the desire of hundreds of millions, if not more, people from all over the world to leave their homelands and live somewhere else, possibly in Western Europe with countless already established immigrant communities, are for sure not going anywhere as well. So, as I said, while there might be, should be, and hopefully will be adjustments to the immigration and assimilation policies, all things considered, it is highly unlikely that Western Europe will undergo some rehomogenization in the near future. There might be more deportations and even willing exodus if the policies regarding the integration and welfare systems are hardened, but it would be limited in scope and would likely encompass the most problematic and recent newcomers. Now, running a multi-ethnic state comes with its challenges, since with ethnic diversity inevitably comes an increased danger of ethnic grievances and conflict. We already see it in many parts of Western Europe, such as the UK. In 2022, there were riots and ethnic violence taking place in the English city of Leicester. A very large part of Leicester's population comes from the Indian peninsula, with circa 33% of the population of Leicester being Muslim and 25% Hindu. The unrest was sparked by the Hindus celebrating India's victory in a cricket match against Pakistan in the 2022 Asia Cricket Cup. I mean, that is on you Anglos. You should not have expected to introduce such an incredibly exciting sport to the colonies without them folks taking it really seriously, right? Nevertheless, what is striking about the approach of the British state towards such riots is the insistence on the solution in the form of consulting and negotiating with the so-called community leaders of different ethnic and religious communities of immigration backgrounds. That is basically a resignation on the basic liberal paradigm of a neutral state that approaches its citizens as individuals with clearly defined rights and duties, whose religious, ethnic and cultural backgrounds are their private matters, separated from the public sphere. It resembles some form of imperial administration, figuring out the issues between subjected peoples by giving concessions and maintaining a balance between different groups, by negotiating with some tribal leaders. And all things considered, this is probably not the worst approach. Managing the future European multi-ethnic populations will likely require a lot of this. However, there is one crucial flaw in the present approach. There remains one quite significant ethnic group without the right to also have its community leaders consulted and listened to. And those are the natives. Specifically, the native working classes. Now, it is simplistic and false to see this as some kind of clear-cut division between the natives and the immigrants. Different immigrant communities have different politics, different relationships to the states where they live, and are differently prone to integration, economic and educational success, and many other things. The aforementioned Indian community in the UK seems to prefer the Conservative Party, and to view the British state and identity more favourably, while the British Muslims tended to vote overwhelmingly for the Labour Party in the past, and now seem to prefer independent Muslim candidates more and more. Even though these communities are surely not monolithic, and you will find many deviating individuals, there are some prevailing trends. And similarly, the native majorities cannot be considered a single coherent bloc. The harsh anti-immigration views are far from being universally prevalent among the native populations. Among the college-educated classes connected to the metropolitan-based globalized economic hubs, or the people participating in the functioning of the technocratic managerial regime in the mass corporations, state bureaucracies, media, universities and creative industries, such sentiments are far less common. Sometimes it is due to personal interests and stakes in the continuation of the system. Sometimes due to pure residential separation from the negative consequences of mass immigration and social change. And sometimes just due to different psychological makeup of people. The harshest resentment is concentrated among the native working classes and self-employed people without college degrees, who are not integrated into the globalized, knowledge-based economic networks and its cosmopolitan culture. People who still remain firmly grounded in their national identities and customs. Now, many Western states experiencing mass immigration have indulged in what Eric Kaufmann calls asymmetrical multiculturalism. What it means is that there is an appeal towards post-ethnic cosmopolitan identity being pushed in regards to the native white majorities, while the ethnic minorities are incentivized to hold on to their ethnic and cultural identities. Kaufmann writes about the ideas of the liberal progressive writer Randolph Bourne, who was active in the early 20th century Greenwich Village bohemian circles. Quote, "Cosmopolitanism must manage the contradiction between its ethos of transcending ethnicity and its need for cultural diversity, which requires ethnic attachment. Bourne resolved this by splitting the world into two moral planes. One for a parental majority, who would be asked to shed their ethnicity and oppose their own culture, and the other for childlike minorities, who would be urged to embrace their heritage in the strongest terms." End of quote. While this might, at first sight, seem like oikophobia and unfair treatment of your own ethnic group, you can also immediately see the very subtle, condescending approach towards ethnic minorities visible in this statement. They are not seen as agents in the same manner as the European populations are. Israeli writer Yoram Hazony, in his book Virtues of Nationalism, presents another interesting thesis in this regard. He claims that many European liberals have a sort of passively aggressive, condescending view of the non-European peoples, because they perceive them as in a much less developed, more savage stage of their development, while European peoples have already reached a phase of post-national moral and political maturity. They thus apply different standards in international affairs when nations they perceive as European, and thus eligible to be held against the European standards of moral maturity are evaluated, and when nations or peoples perceived as non-European are. That, according to Hazony, has manifested many times in the moral vilification and the disgust directed at Israel throughout the decades. The apartheid regime in South Africa in the 1980s, Serbia in the 1990s, the more isolationist facets of American politics, or certain post-communist EU countries like Hungary and Poland, when they deviate from the standards of perceived European moral maturity. That is not to suggest that these countries are all in the same category, or that some of them have not committed possibly deplorable deeds, but to showcase that when countries perceived as European commit them, the moral reaction to them is very much amplified, in comparison with non-Europeans, which are seen almost as childlike savages, not really responsible for their deeds to the same extent. But that is a dangerous misconception. Non-European peoples are no children, and ethnic Europeans are not some different post-ethnic enlightened species freed from the natural instincts of humankind. What this will inevitably lead to is the re-emergence and the embracement of unapologetically ethnic identity among parts of the native populations as well. I have made an entire video about the fact that our identities as human groups are, to an extent, relative, and we always need an external group, the other, to define ourselves against. Since no identity is absolute, to define the in-group, we need an out-group. The most effective way to designate who we are is by pointing to someone else and thus defining who we are not. One of the interesting sights that occurred during the riots in the UK was footage of Catholic and Protestant men in Northern Ireland standing next to each other during the protests and waving Irish and Union Jack flags. That is a prime example of how this shifting of identity might work. A couple of decades ago, the fathers of these people might have been trying to install car bombs under each other's vehicles. However, the emergence of others who were different enough from both the Catholics and Protestants might suddenly brush these differences aside. Of course, there were not unsimilar riots to those in the UK taking place in Ireland a couple of months ago. And it will, sooner or later, happen in other European countries as well, unless the ethnic grievances are very skillfully managed, which can be successfully doubted. It is just a reality of high diversity that has been taken to its logical conclusion. The sudden emergence of minority groups of non-European origin, many of whom are quite skillful in pushing their ethnocultural interests in the European political systems, creates a space for the hardening and definition of group interests of the native populations as well. While as recently as a couple of decades ago, terms like white German, white Swede, white English or British did not really have that much substance and meaning in defining one's interests and values in the realm of national politics, this is now firmly changing. In many European countries, you have anti-immigration political parties that are electorally anchored in a very clearly defined group. Native people without college education, more often men than women. Now, these kinds of divisions will never be absolute. You will always find outliers, like college-educated natives or members of minorities voting for these parties. But their electoral base is almost always the aforementioned group. They are representing their socio-economic and cultural interests. We can observe the social fabric of many Western European societies slowly disintegrating to the point where different groups have such opposing visions of their country that it is hard to reconcile. That is a severe problem for democracy. You need a certain common set of myths, symbols, and narratives shared by the vast majority of the population. Thus, a white working-class Englishman who feels like he has a deep, unchallenged right to the land where he lives and the favor of the British state, due to his English ethnicity and the fact that his ancestors have inhabited the island for many centuries. Liberal, London-based professional who believes that British people should leave the antiquated ethnic identifications in the past and celebrate the diverse global culture. And a Brit of Pakistani descent with a strong interest in keeping as many of his traditions and ways of life intact, share any such set of myths, symbols, and narratives. We might see the states apply increasingly authoritarian methods to sustain some level of social cohesion. While it might seem counterintuitive at first, the probability of the politicization of ethnicity and, thus, the emergence of ethnic conflict, whether political or physical, is actually higher in democracy. Many scholars have noticed that there has been a correlation between the spread of democracy and ethnic conflict throughout the third world during the second half of the 20th century. As Paul Morland noted in his book Demographic Engineering, Population Strategies in Ethnic Conflict, quote, "The spread of democracy beyond the West has intensified the centrality of ethnicity to politics. As democratic governments have come to take an intense interest in the identities and identifications of the populations within their territories. As democracy has spread, so too has the politicization of ethnicity. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz argues that the institution of universal suffrage makes the temptation to court the masses by appealing to traditional loyalties virtually irresistible. The interaction of ethnicity and party systems shows that ethnicity is in many cases defining determinant of politics in many post-colonial states." End of quote. So, the process of politicization of ethnicity, which began in the late 18th century Europe and has spread throughout the world, wreaking a lot of havoc during the process, is now returning home. The cycle is completed. We should get used to it. It is not going anywhere.